Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Kabir, and I'm with Battle River Research Group. I will be your host today. Today, we have Dr. Preston Sorensen. He will be talking about carbon sequestration in prairie farms. Before we dive in, I'd like to take a moment to thank all the counties that support and fund us. Because of them, we are able to organize webinars like these. A quick housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the presentation, please hold them until very end. We will have 15 minutes for Q&A session. However, something urgent comes up and you need my help during the webinar, feel free to type it in the chat section. I will be keeping an eye on it throughout the session. Without further ado, let's begin today's webinar. And now please join me in welcoming our special guest speaker. Over to you, Dr. Preston.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. So I'll just talk a little bit more about myself and then kind of what the plan is today for today's webinar. So I'm a soil scientist. I'm a professional research associate with the University of Saskatchewan, where my focus of my work is a lot on mapping soil carbon and then modeling soil carbon change over time. I've been heavily involved with the Regenerative Alberta Living Lab project as well. I grew up working on my uncle's sort of mixed oilseed grain and cattle farm northeast of Melfort, Saskatchewan, before then developing kind of passion for soil science and studying that at university. I actually lived in Edmonton for over 10 years, where I worked in between my master's and PhD. I worked for an environmental consulting company. So I've actually spent a lot of time in the Battle River area. I spent a lot of time around Concert, Provost, Coronation, Halkirk during my years, although I definitely found I had a lot more passion for agriculture than I do for environmental cleanup for the oil and gas industry. So I was very happy to move back into the more agriculture space. So the topic of today's, well, it's about carbon sequestration in prairie farms. I'm going to spend most of the time talking about what drives variation in soil properties, and with soil carbon being one of them. And then just a little bit about, well, how do we measure? What are things we need to consider when measuring soil carbon? And then what are some trajectories for how we expect soil carbon to change over time? Um, Now, just hold on a second. Oh, there we go. So I want to start by talking about soils are highly variable across landscapes, and we need to think of them. They're three-dimensional, um, three-dimensional substances, and so they're going to vary across the landscape. I think, if you put yourself in your fields and you think about what do you see, right? These trends that are being illustrated in this diagram. Um, Hopefully, please see. Well, I don't there. Hopefully, you can see my pointer here. But if you think about this, is just a diagram showing where water moves in the landscape in the Canadian prairies. A lot of where we have carbon and differences in carbon. A lot of it has to do with where water is going. So you can think about, okay, you've got your field. Well, there's not just one um, soil carbon content in your field. It's going to vary as you go from the tops of your hills into the swales and into the depressions. You're going to get more carbon. And so you're going to get variation over the landscape and soil properties. So when we're, as soil scientists, when we're thinking about soil, we just move some of these things out of the way. Okay. When we're uh, thinking about what drives differences in soil, we talk about soil forming factors. And so that goes back to 1941. The person who gets most of credit for this was a Swiss American soil scientist named Hans Jenny. However, independently, Ellis from Manitoba also developed the same formula. But he also put two extra factors in, although people tend to talk about Jenny more than Ellis, although they deserve equal credit. So Jenny talked about if you think about what soil property, so we could think what soil carbon we're going to see at any point. It depends on the climate, so amount of rain, amount of temperature and evaporation, the types of organisms, so that includes the types of plants, grasses versus trees, relief, so where are you on the landscape? Are you at the top of a hill or at the bottom? The types of parent material, so that would be the types of sediments the soil is developed in, as well as the amount of time it's had to form. And then also we've got to consider human activity. This is Ellis's additional contributions and also groundwater. So we can find a lot of difference when you're getting things like saline groundwater discharges. Um, so I think there's been a lot of focus over the last few years with so the soil health movement has been a good thing that has, I think, raised a lot of attention to the importance of how we're managing soils for the long-term productivity and how we can improve things. But I think it's also important to remember that soil varies for a lot of reasons, and so you got to be really careful with across the fence comparisons for that reason. So the other main thing we need to think about for soil formation and soil change is that soil is constantly changing. It might be changing quite slowly from a human perspective, but it's constantly changing. And the way we think about it as soil scientists is we think about there being additions, losses, transfers, and transformations. And so we've got things like addition of things like precipitation, we've got organic matters getting added. We're going to have losses from things such as erosion, but then also you've got other processes going on, like clay getting transferred over time from, depending on the types of soils, from the upper layer to the lower, or your calcium carbonate, which is common in our soils, getting transferred, and then transformation. So as that organic matter gets added from plants, it gets decomposed and transformed, turned into stable soil aggregates. So main takeaway when we think about soil, there's both different factors that affect the soil type, and then we've got processes of additions, losses, transfers, and transformations always going on. So, in terms of things that are really important to think about when we think about soil differences in Alberta and your region, is that the parent material, which is the type of sediments that the soils developed in, are all developed in what are called glacial sediments. So, if you go back about 10,000 years ago, all of Alberta was covered in glaciers, all the Canadian prairies entirely. And then as over time, those glaciers melted. And when they melted, they left behind different types of sediments. So the most important ones being lacustrine, fluvial, moraine, or till would be the three most common. We can also have what are called colluvium happening on hill slopes and alluvium where you've got streams hitting water bodies. But from our perspective, so when that glacier was retreating, it just dumped all the sediments that it had in the ice. You can think about, if you're looking at those, the plowed up ridges of snow on the side of the road, glacier's a lot like that. It's a mix of ice, but also rock and other material. And so as the glacier melted, it just dumped that all behind. That would be what is our glacial till. So that would be, you think about our more hilly landscapes, you've got a mix of sand, silt, and clay, you've got rocks and stones in there. But you also, as the glacier melted, it created rivers, and much bigger rivers than anything we would see today. And so these rivers, because they're so high energy, all the clay and silt stayed suspended in the water, and only sand and gravels got left behind. So that's why you'll find areas that have lots of sand and gravel. And then you'll have lacustrine sediments. So this would be like around Edmonton, or if you're driving on the Trans-Canada, Regina would be the sort of the most classic example of this, the Regina Plain or much of Manitoba. But when you had these rivers melting off the glacier, um, bumping up against the glacier, then it created giant lakes. And so these lakes, then all the sand settles out in the river. And then as you move further into the lake, you get sort of fine sand, then silt, then clay depositing. So then we can get these giant clay deposits. So that explains most of what we get in terms of variability, in terms of types of parent material that drive major differences in soil types and soil carbon. And then, of course, as I already mentioned, we have to think about topography. And so, as you move down a hill slope, what would be a classic sequence of soils? So, I've just got our soil classification terms here. But what we have to think about is that on these kind of shoulder slope positions, you'll often find in the prairies what we call a regosolic soil. So, this is a very thin topsoil and then no real other soil there. Chernozemic, where you're kind of getting your sort of regular, you might have, a 6 inch 6 to 10 inch topsoil layer over kind of a brownish subsoil before you hit the whitish soil underneath. And then as you move to the bottom, you're going to see a glisolic soil, which are waterlogged soil. So if you ever are digging and you see as you dig down, there's those bluish, greenish, grayish clays, that would be glisolic soil. So waterlogged soils tend to have thick topsoil. Um, Probably great for production in dry years, maybe waterlogging and saturated in wetter years. And then you'll find this re sequence repeating over and over again all across, landscapes in the prairies. And so to give you some idea of these pictures, we might have this is just illustrating maps of soil types. So where you might have these waterlogged soils in blue, pink ones being those thin topsoil locations, white being kind of regular. And so that would might be where the glisolic soils would be the example in the bottom left corner here, that really thick A horizon, kind of dullish gray, but with some reddish colors intermixed, versus more upper slope where you're getting a thin topsoil horizon. And when I talk about glacial till, this would be an example of glacial till. We've got these rocks kind of throughout. So, main takeaways is that when we're talking about carbon and carbon sequestration, we have to think about where's our starting place, and our starting place is going to be different depending on the soil properties. And you might think this land just over the fence is a good comparison, but there's a very good chance. Like you could often think if something's being managed as a pasture and over the fence it's cropland, there's often a reason for that, right? So, um, as producers familiar with your land, I'm sure you know this, but I think you might find a lot of people, I guess increasingly myself used to just sitting in an office, right? But if you're not used to being out on the land, right, or someone's trying to design a study, they might not be thinking about all of these factors driving these differences. So this is just to mention these glaciations. So what we found, there was some pretty complex glaciers all over. If we go to, I guess, Battle River region in here, there was one big glacier that moved down the middle and then spread out. But there were some other smaller glaciers that were spread throughout. So this can be quite a complex mix of sediments throughout the Canadian prairies. And I've been talking about these fine scale. If you think about our soil variation in Alberta, this is at a very coarse scale, right? We've got our precipitation gradient where we're going as you move. You got your brown soils in the southeast, and then as you move northwest, you move right into as it gets to be more net precipitation, so amount of rainfall compared to evapotranspiration, right? You get an increase in carbon moving from dark brown to black before you start to head into the dark gray, and then the what we used to be called gray wooded soils, or now we call gray luvisols. Um, I see there's a comment saying there's playback in the sound. So let me know if that is a continued issue. And so we get this variation throughout the province. um, which can also include throughout much of East Central Alberta, lots of what we call solenitic soils. So these are naturally high salinity soils because of the types of parent material. Those glaciers ground up a lot of marine shales. So rocks that had developed in seabeds historically. And then when you combine that with groundwater and evaporation dynamics, you get a lot of salts naturally, which then affects growth of plants, which then over time affects the amount of carbon. So these are the other main things we need to consider. So, taking all this, how do we deal with all this variation in modern days? Well, soil mapping is kind of our main tool to try to characterize some of this variation. And so, we think about the history of soil survey. Systemic soil surveys began in the 20s in Alberta, delineating Alberta into those broad zones that I showed you, brown, black, and gray wooded, and then more detailed work expanding that up until the 1980s to make uh, agricid. It kind of is in its modern form. And so agracid's a great product, but the thing you have to consider about with map scale is that it's really not characterizing the map, the variability be below what I'd say is about a section in size. Like something needs to be about a section in area to really be mapped out. Otherwise, there'll be notes that describe, okay, there's these soils occurring along the hill slopes. But it does lack that really subfield scale variability, which is why one of the things that we're working with a lot is the development of predictive soil mapping tools. So this is based on the idea of soil forming factors, where we're trying to predict a soil property as a function of different forming factors. And with those factors, again, being climate, organisms, topography, parent material, also time, and then also considering about just spatial variation. And so what we're trying to do is find remote sensing variables, so satellite imagery, elevation model data that's correlated with these soil forming factors, so we can predict soil carbon or other soil properties at a given location. And so what we'll do is we'll take all these different input layers, put them into a machine learning model, and out of that, we'll make a predictive map predicting, in this case, the amount of carbon at each location. The thing that I want you to kind of remember from this, though, is that what we're doing is we're taking, we need to take measurements at known locations, illustrated by the points on this map. And we need to say, okay, what combination of remote sensing variables are associated with this amount of, say, soil carbon, and use that to build a predictive model to then predict values that are unmeasured locations. So it is not a direct measurement. It's not like we're getting a direct signal from a satellite to measure carbon. So if a company is telling you that they can directly measure carbon with a satellite, they can't. They're being misleading about what they're actually doing. We're inferring soil properties and predicting them based on the relationship between variables and measured locations. So we have to have field data, at least data from some fields to draw those relationships from. And the other point I want to make is these types of approaches are good at interpolating. So if we've seen, okay, this combination of variables is associated with this carbon content, and we can see, okay, these combinations occur everywhere on this map, it does a pretty good job. But if there's a combination of variables it's never seen before, or carbon values higher than it's ever seen before, it doesn't do a good job. So what kind of say scientifically is that it extrapolates poorly. So you have to be very careful in how you apply these and making sure you're not applying them to conditions you've never seen before. So for example, I couldn't take this model built in Alberta and just apply it to Manitoba because while it's still the prairies, the particular combination of variables is too different. I'd need to get data from Manitoba. So looking at some of these variables, this is from the Peace Country, but what we'll do is we'll pull in things like, well, what's the total precipitation over the whole area? Well, for organisms, we'll get data for the different vegetation. So whether often that'll be satellite imagery, the direct imagery, or remote sensing variables such as normalized difference vegetation index or NDVI that you've probably heard of that is related to the amount of photosynthetic activity of the plants. And then really important in the prairies would be relief. From going back to the examples I showed you, we know that soil properties vary a lot with slope position. And so having a good elevation model, we can take that and we can then run different calculations to generate what we call terrain derivatives that will be related to, for example, slope position. So this is something, a map made from a digital elevation model. So blue would be low-lying areas, red would be the upper slope areas, and then yellow and orange would be in between. And so we can then take this and to put into our model account for that different slope positions. And from that, we can go ahead and make a map. This would be an example of work I did in Saskatchewan. Um, this was at about 200-meter resolution, so this is just zoomed out, but mapping out so our organic carbon uh, throughout the agriculture area of Saskatchewan. So again, we can see things like the influence of the clays in the Regina Plains holding more water, leading to more plant growth, leading to more carbon. Same thing if you go to my hometown around here, you're getting lots of carbon because it's good amounts of precipitation, lots of clay. And so then we can map out these soil properties at finer scale and then use that to measure management to try to interpret what's going on with management. And so it's focused a lot on carbon, but we can measure other things like total nitrogen, cation exchange capacity, as well as soil texture works well. So clay content, sand content here are just in texture classes, but really trying to pull out some of those high clay content areas. I reversed the scales here just between sand so that way they would have similar patterns. So darker means low sand and high clay. And so with that, we can use this to try to get a better idea of how much variation is going on across a region or a landscape. And so from that, kind of give you an idea of this is how we're trying to map carbon. And so in the Regenerative Alberta Living Lab, this is kind of the main tool we're using, where we're using predictive soil mapping to map variation in soil carbon. And then we can then relate that to see, okay, well, accounting for the natural variation, what influences management happening? Um, but the other things we need to think about is how can we measure soil carbon? So when it comes to measuring soil carbon, there's two things we need to think about. We need to think about how are we collecting samples across the landscape, knowing that soil is so variable. And then the other factor is how are we measuring that with what lab method are we using? And so you might be used to kind of just a regular grid sampling or random sampling, um, but there has been development of some really good new tools for sampling, particularly to ensure we're characterizing the variability properly. And so what we call those are feature space coverage sampling. So these are designs where we look at the variation in the remote sensing imagery and we try to ensure that we're collecting samples across that range, particularly because machine learning doesn't work well if you don't have the variability covered. And then we also are trying to cover that variation with as few as samples as possible. You could still cover it with a grid, but you'd end up having to take a lot more samples that way. And so if we look at, I'll just gonna skip that one actually. So this figure here is showing, so the axes aren't that important, but what they're showing is we've just done a mathematical tool, so we can take all the variability from our satellite images and we can just plot the variability on these two scales. So basically, this is saying that um, these colors here are more similar to each other than these things over here. And so this is the full variation. So if you just went and did a random or grid sampling, often these plus signs represent where samples would have been taken. And so you end up sampling across really heavily in what are the most commonly occurring features, which means that we're not able to capture some of these uh, these more extreme situations for mapping or testing some of these things. And so by using a feature space covering uh, design where we've distributed these points out using this mathematical operation to cover the range of variation, we can then distribute the points like this. So this is the same plot. This is just plotting all the potential sampling locations, basically every pixel on our map. Um, and then we're distributing the points more evenly across this variance, and so we can get a lot better maps, a lot more accurate maps for less points than you'd need to collect otherwise. Sorry, maybe I'll skip back here, but th- these are a little out of order, but I'll skip back here. So, when we're talking about measuring soil carbon, the other thing I want to mention is that there's two kind of main methods for measuring soil organic carbon. So if you're thinking about the data you get when you're submitting your standard samples for nutrient analysis, and they give you an organic matter number, they're going to give you a value based on loss on ignition, which is where you take the soil sample and you burn it at high temperature to burn off all the carbon and you measure the weight change. So the problem with this method is fine for giving you kind of a general number of how much organic matter is there. But if you've got lots of clay, there's water adhered to the clay molecules that is also lost. So you end up with an inflated organic carbon content in high clay soils using this method. And so while it's perfectly good for sort of general farm management, it's not precise enough for us to do really detailed soil carbon change. The gold standard is a method called dry combustion, where you're taking a sample, you're burning it off, but then you're measuring the amount of carbon dioxide released. You're not just measuring the weight change. And so that's the gold standard way to do it if you want to have a lot more precision. And so I'm talking a lot about soil organic carbon, so sorry to skip around here, but I also wanted to maybe reframe this to think about there's been a lot of focus and attention on carbon credits and carbon sequestration. And I think it's important we remember what is all the functions that soil organic matter has and soil organic carbon. And so it improves soil structure, it improves nutrient cycling as you build more carbon, it helps regulate water, it's essential for microbial function. So if you think about the your soil's got a big organic nitrogen pool that's not available for plants. The microbes are what are there that make it available for plants. And then of course, carbon sequestration is a part of it, but I think it's important we remember all of these functions as I kind of move in to discussing more ideas about how we increase organic matter. If we're talking about and thinking about climate change, and again, if people are spending, a lot of interest in soil carbon credits, the point I'd like to make is that people are talking about soil carbon as a part of nature-based solutions for climate change. Um, but I think it's also important that we remember that because of increasing soil organic carbon improves nutrient cycling and water retention, building your soil organic matter is also sort of one of our best mechanisms for adapting to climate change. And so I guess this is just maybe my point I wanted to make is that despite all the talk about carbon credits, I think personally I view it as improving the long-term productivity of the soil is really the most important reason to build soil organic carbon. If that helps with, if there's a way to monetize that or it helps the climate change, great. But I would say the long-term productivity is really the reason to do it. Um, Kind of jumping back into methods, the other thing I want to talk about is that when we're talking about soil carbon, there's actually two types of carbon in the soil. There's organic carbon that comes from the plants. That's what the plants are adding to the soil. But there's also inorganic carbon. So that's calcium carbonate. So when the glaciers were moving through, they ground up a bunch of limestone, and so that limestone is deposited throughout the soils in the Canadian prairies. And so if we think back to the old summer fallow days, and you think about the tops of your hills being kind of whitish, that's because all the topsoil was scraped off and eroded, which you can see down in the depression here, leaving behind the exposed parent material high in calcium carbonate, making it kind of whitish. And so when we're talking about soil carbon from a what we're influencing, we're talking about organic carbon, not the inorganic carbon. And it's important that we distinguish between these two because if you're talking about no-till or other management practices, what you're affecting is your soil organic carbon, not the inorganic carbon. And soil inorganic carbon can affect carbon measurements quite significantly if you're not changing your methods properly for them. So, what are some applications that we've done in Alberta to try to use predictive soil mapping tools to look at how different factors affect the amounts of soil carbon sequestration? So this was published in 2023. This was work done with Food Water Wellness was the spearhead of this, Kim Cornish, and this is sort of the beginning work that led to the Regenerative Alberta Living Lab project, where samples were collected across Alberta and used to map soil organic carbon. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but this is just with any mapping tool, you've got to make sure that you're evaluating the performance on it. Because of all the variation, our fits are never perfect. But this performance value, this is a correlation value of 0.75, is pretty good for this type of project. So we use that to then generate a map of soil organic carbon stocks throughout Alberta. And the thing I want to point out, right, if you look at where you are, right, and it starts to get higher as you move northwest, it's not because of anything you're doing, it's just you got more water as you move to the northwest. And so that, and there's always going to be more carbon there as a result of that. So you have to kind of keep those things in mind when you're thinking about changes and differences. So we use this map to try to look at, well, what's the effect of maintaining things as rangelands versus croplands, and what's the benefit we get in soil organic carbon? And so we use that map to compare croplands versus pasture and forages throughout Alberta. And so we've got the soil organic carbon stock to 100 centimeters in tons per hectare on the y-axis here. On the x-axis, we have soil types. So because we know that there's so much difference based on soil type, we wanted to factor for that in the analysis and then look at, well, what's the difference between cropland soil organic carbons and pasture and forage soil organic carbon stocks after accounting for the soil differences. So what we found is that pretty much universally throughout, across all soil types, there's more carbon in the pastures and rangelands, ranging from about an extra 2 tons per hectare on the drier end to I think about up to 8 tons per hectare on average for the wetter soils. And so with the bigger differences occurring where the wetter soils were occurring, particularly because more water means more crop growth, which means more carbon additions to the ground. However, the thing I want to point out from this type of analysis, where we're just looking at existing pastures versus croplands, um, and we'll look at depth here. So this is just another way to look at that. And so you can see that while we have an increase everywhere, so that increase is greater at the surface compared to as you move down, which again isn't surprising because you're getting more carbon additions at surface. But the thing I want to point out with this is that we've got a problem of what I call which is called survivorship bias. So this figure is kind of a famous example of the survivorship bias problem. So it goes back to in World War II when they were tasked to look at where do you reinforce planes coming back from bombing missions. And if they sum up, the red dots are all everywhere a plane came back that had damage. And so if you think, well, that's where the planes are getting damaged, that's where we should reinforce. It's actually the opposite. It's that any planes that get damaged in the cockpit or the engines are not making it back at all. And so you have to consider which sample points aren't you getting. And so that comes back to the cropland versus pasture problem is that so we've got more carbon in the pasture than the croplands, even though the vast majority of the high clay soils, unless they're saline, have been converted to cropland. So our higher clay soils that are generally the more productive ones are preferentially converted to cropland. So it's not a complete apples to apples comparison. And so the way I have to think about it is that the pastures and forage lands has more carbon, even though they tend to, on average, be less favorable for plant growth than what's used for croplands. So one of the kind of next questions we had was like, okay, well, how is management going to continue to change things over time? And so a project I did in Saskatchewan really was looking at how can we leverage these better maps of carbon variation spatially, so the differences over the landscape. How can we link them with different types of models that can let us try to estimate how things are going to change through time? So what we did was we took our historical maps of organic carbon stock along with precipitation and temperature data, as well as wheat yield data to estimate the amounts of carbon going into the land every year. Put it into what's called the biogeochemical process model, called the Century model, which lets us see how things are going to change over time in order to forecast future carbon changes. And so this is based on results in Saskatchewan. Based on this modeling, we can look at, well, how did soil organic carbon change because of the adoption of no-till in Saskatchewan, and how is it likely to change? I'm happy to answer more details about this, but just trying to manage for time. So we can look historically, we gained about 3 tons per hectare of carbon on average. And then these lines represent different future climate scenarios. So this yellow line would be a low amounts of climate change. Red would be uh, standard sort of business as usual kind of current trends, and red would be high. So this is basically low, medium, high amounts of climate change. The reason we don't know is we don't know what future emissions are going to be. And so what we can see is that we've got kind of an increasing trend predicted for all of them, but the amount of carbon that we can expect to sequester from no-till into the future is going to be less if there's more climate change. And the other point I wanted to make is that if we look at um, historically, yes, it was about 2.8 tons per hectare of carbon was sequestered due to the adoption of no-till in Saskatchewan over the past 30 years. Over the next 30 years, depending on the amounts of climate change, we can expect 1.4 to 1.7 tons per hectare. So basically half of what we've gained historically to a little over half. And over the next, and then to go over the next 75 years, it'll go from about 2.3 to 3.1 tons per hectare. So basically, the takeaway from this work is that um, our soils probably aren't saturated, like some people are suggested. No-till is likely to continue to sequester carbon, but we're only going to gain about half as much over the next 30 years of what we've gained in the past, and it's going to take 75 years to get the gains that we gained over the last 30, because as you add carbon and it increases, the soil starts to approach a new equilibrium, and you've got to increase those inputs if you want to keep it increasing. Um, so that's kind of what we're expecting over time. But again, in terms of some of the more recent work that we've done as part of the Regenerative Alberta Living Lab, one of the big things that we're finding is that we talked about variability. So we're having big effects from variability. So what this is showing you is about the amounts of soil organic carbon. And so the black lines are just the agricid polygons where I've mapped out the different parent materials. So we can see we've got glacial lacustrine here, GLLC. So those are our high clay lake sediments. We've got our glacial till here. So this would be our just deposited mixed sediments, kind of hilly. And so we can see that there are some big effects just from the parent materials with the high uh, high clay glacial lacustrine sediments having more carbon than the till landscapes, with the exception of some of these low-lying parts in the till landscape. And so it's not that the producer, no one's doing anything wrong for management, but you have to be very careful because if you were to compare this site to this site, um, looking for a management effect, you're actually just seeing a clay content and parent material effect, not a management effect. So we have to look at management after accounting for some of these differences. The other takeaway about variability that I want you all to think about is that soil organic matter and carbon varies over time, and actually on kind of a short time frame, not just in addition to spatially. And so this is from data from southeastern Saskatchewan. The black line is the organic matter concentration, and this is a 100% no-till operation in southeast Saskatchewan. The blue line is the amounts of precipitation. Here's our 2021 drought. And so what we can see is that the organic matter contents um, track the amounts of precipitation quite closely. And so while we can expect soil organic matter to go up, if you're doing management, if you're engaging in management that's building up soil organic matter over a longer time period, we can definitely be confident there's going to be an increase. But in the short term, it's really going to depend on the amount of precipitation. And good management can reduce the amount of loss that's happening. But let's say if you're going to go do a carbon credit, right, and you did your first measurement in 2026, and you came back in 5 years and did another one in 2021, right, you're going to say, okay, there was a loss of carbon. But that loss of carbon has nothing to do with management. It's strictly drought and precipitation that led to those losses. So those are some of the other things we need to be thinking about in terms of soil carbon changes. So the final thing that I want to kind of talk about today before we move into questions is that if we're talking about soil carbon sequestration, so increasing the amount of soil organic carbon, we have to go back to the process, which is that of how we build soil organic matter, which is that you have plants, they photosynthesize, then they have carbon added to the soil by their roots and by the above ground residues left behind that aren't removed during harvest. That carbon decomposes and turns and gets associated with the mineral soil and stabilizes for the long term. However, as you increase inputs, you start to get where a new equilibrium's reached, where rates of decomposition start to match rates of the new inputs. And so at a certain point, if you want to keep increasing soil organic matter, you have to start thinking about how do I keep increasing the amount of soil organic carbon being added to the soil. So people are exploring different ideas. So cover cropping's one, but again, whether cover cropping is appropriate, I think farming is very regional and local. So, for example, a lot of the cover cropping work in Southern Ontario suggests that there's benefits to this. However, Southern Ontario has a longer growing season, um, particularly with lots of winter wheat in the rotation, and it's got a lot more precipitation. So cover cropping may be an appropriate strategy for Southern Ontario, but uh, if you want to talk about shorter growing season, water limited parts of the prairies, it's probably not the right tool. Just like no-till has been slower to be adopted in parts of Manitoba because of issues with soil temperatures not warming up fast enough or drying out fast enough for seeding. Um, at least from the regenerative Alberta Living Lab, we're seeing a lot of potential benefits from things like bale grazing or swath grazing because you're importing a bunch of organic matter to the site, right? And then the animal activity is helping speed up its decomposition. But again, this involves, having the labor available for the temporary fencing, having either cattle yourself or relationships with cattle producers in order to make it feasible. So I think there's not a one size fits all for how do you increase soil organic carbon. It really depends on what's your operation, where are you, what management practices make sense. But what it really needs to come back to, though, is if you want to think about adopting something, you really need to think about how am I increasing the amount of soil organic matter, or how am I increasing the amount of organic matter getting added to the soil from plant activity. That's the big things, whether that's coming from roots or from the above ground biomass. So, kind of takeaways from this talk, if there's sort of three things that I want you to remember from this, it's that soil organic carbon is controlled by many factors, not just management. Management is important, but it's not the only thing. And in some cases, it may be only 10% of the effect of some of the other things. That said, management's the only thing you can really control. So you really need to think about how you're improving things over time, not just necessarily looking at what's going on across the fence. Measurement methods are really important, both where are we sampling and what methods are being used to measure things, because loss on ignition, agronomic organic matter data is not directly comparable to data done with dry combustion. And that if you want to increase soil organic carbon, it requires increasing carbon inputs to the soil. Um, so that has to be happening if you're really going to increase soil organic carbon. But you also have to remember you cannot overcome natural variation. You're not going to make a low-lying saline area as productive as a non-saline area, no matter what you do. So you have to think about those natural limits and natural variation. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. And once again, thank you for the opportunity to give this presentation.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Preston. Now we'll open the floor for Q&A. If there is any questions, you feel free to type it in the Q&A section or in the comment section. And if there's someone who doesn't like typing, can always raise their hand and I can allow them to talk. There is a question for you.
I see
Can
that.
adding, sorry, uh, can adding humic to the soil help you with organic carbon in the soil?
So I'm not quite sure what's meant by humic. Whether you're thinking about adding humus or like adding a humic acid product. I don't know if you're able to clarify.
Uh, I think so. He meant humic product.
Okay.
Yeah,
I personally would be skeptical about that.
yeah, humic product.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. I would be really skeptical. Now, there might be some like that the humic acids products, there is organic matter there that you're adding. Um, but I think you really would be cautious from the cost benefit of doing that. I personally would be quite skeptical. I would expect any benefit you have is going to be very marginal, and that um, management practices that are going to leave more crop residues behind, I would expect would have a way bigger benefit. But I'd be skeptical they would be worth the money, honestly.
Perfect. There is another question for you. Chemical fertilizer adds organic material. What is the balance we need or takes away from soil organism carbon creation?
Yeah, so so I'm definitely pro chemical fertilizer, to be clear. I think ultimately it's a balance of your crops need nutrients to grow. And and so you need to ensure that nutrient supply is there. And so um they're an important part of the toolkit. Um, I'd say building up soil organic matter, it should be, I do think it should be a balance. So doing things to build up the soil organic matter is important because one, it'll help you retain the nutrients that you add with chemical fertilizers, but it's also going to be increase your supply of nutrients naturally from the soil. And so if you're building that up, you could definitely potentially reduce some of your chemical fertilizer additions, right? Hopefully save money. I also understand for crop production though, there's kind of a, you know, you it makes sense to try to yield rationalize when you think or yield maximize when you think of all the capital costs you got to carry. So I understand also, there being a hesitancy to reduce fertilizer inputs. But yeah, I'd say a balance is important.
Perfect. Coming back to the last question, the question before, there was a follow-up on that humic product
Yeah.
question. Would it be a long-term option to add the humic?
Um, I guess it comes back to, I don't necessarily see a ton of risks from adding it, but I'm personally skeptical that you're going to get much actual benefit from them. And so, I'm not really sure you're going to get your money's worth from it in the long run.
Perfect. So there's another question for you. Do you think there is need for fine tuning of accurate maps?
I would say I wouldn't describe it as fine tuning. I think that there needs to be updates done to soil maps in Alberta, but across Canada, where there needs to be high resolution maps generated with modern approaches using predictive soil mapping. AgriSeed's a great product, but I don't think it really makes sense to try to tweak it. I'd leave it as it is and focus on a soil sampling predictive soil mapping project. I think makes the most sense.
Perfect. Hopefully that answers your question. Are there more questions? Feel free to type it. Until that, is there something else you want to add on to your presentation? By the time people are still typing in.
Oh, I don't think I have anything sort of off the top of my head. I mean, I'm happy to answer any more questions. Yeah, I'd say one of the things that is, I guess maybe I'll add one of the things that really is coming out of the Regenerative Alberta Living Lab is the that natural variation and taking that into account when looking at what management effects there are is really important. Because a lot of what you might assume were good cross the fence comparisons actually have quite different natural soil conditions.
Perfect. There you go. Yeah. Oh, I think so. That question is for me. So are all our webinars are recorded and it's on our YouTube channel, so you can always go there and check it out. Are there any more questions? Is there anything? Oh, yeah. There you go. Soil water is now being said to be higher in soil organism high soils. Is this just inflation improvement or is there air capture of humidity,
This,
i.e., 10 inches of moisture giving certain bushels of crop, now greater amount of crop?
uh, yes. So if you increase your soil organic matter or carbon, uh, it helps retain soil water. So there's a couple mechanisms for that. One is that um, the water will be adhering to the organic matter in the soil directly, but it also increases the amount of very fine pore spaces. And so those pore spaces in the soil, so if we back, soil is a mix of solids, liquids, and air. And so if you have really big gaps, what we call pore space, the water just flushes through really quickly. And so if you increase organic matter, then you get a lot more smaller pores, which hold water better. And so it's actually the precipitation that's being held in sort of the surface soil rather than draining down into the groundwater.
Perfect. Hopefully, Grant, you got your answer.
Maybe I'll just add on that a bit. In
Yep.
a 2021 super drought year, right? It's not going to save you as much as I wish it would, but it's definitely is going to help you in your sort of below average, not full-blown drought years. You'll definitely get benefits from your higher organic matter soils are going to have more water retained. But there's got to be
Uh,
some water there to begin with to retain.
so sorry to interrupt, Dr. Preston. Grant wants to talk to you, so should I?
Sure.
I'm going to allow him to talk.
Yep.
Yeah, Grant. Yeah,
Um,
you can.
can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, we can.
The water one confuses me because I'll hear people say, uh, they just get yields that are over and above everybody else. And I still struggle to understand how we can get more when we have less. And the comment, we almost don't need water has been even thrown out. And that really confuses me. So I appreciate the comments you've made about infiltration, water adhering to organic matter. And so it isn't the respiration of organisms turning humidity in the air into a plant available water that goes over and beyond the rainfall. I'm just trying to understand that a little bit better because so much is being said that is anecdotal, and you're concerned with its accuracy as a professional agrologist.
Definitely, those are great questions, and it's I'd say yeah, it's definitely that's just holding on to the water that's there. I'm a little skeptical. I mean, yeah, I think we're on the same page. You need water, and you need water from the sky, right? Or irrigation to begin with. There's no fixing that problem. I would say, and maybe it comes back to my first reaction if there's these people getting much higher yields. It's like my first reaction is, okay, is it something special they're doing, or is it just something inherent in the land that they're farming that's better? Because it's like if you all did the same thing, would they still get the higher yields, right? Is it just a naturally higher? Because clay is the other big thing for holding water, right? It's why I should give my Saskatchewan references, but it's why some of the best producing land in in west central Saskatchewan is the really, really high clay soils in the brown soil zone because it's holding the water. But those same soils where I'm from in Saskatchewan can sometimes be a problem because they get so waterlogged. And so, if you've got a naturally higher clay soil that's just holding on to the water more, right? It's just that's what's driving your yield bump in a net when you've got a net water loss from evaporation. And now you as a producer, if you can try to build your organic matter, you can start to see some benefits over time. But if you're not getting the yields that some other person is, it's might be because of the land, not because of what they're doing.
Uh, Grant, you need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Okay. Uh, it- my farm is one of the ones Kimberly has sampled.
Yeah, okay, yeah,
And I've also got the benchmarks that Kabir and all of us do with Dr. Yamili Zavala.
yeah,
And we're looking at in these dry years, 400 psi at 0 to 3 inches.
yeah,
And yet, when Kimberly sampled our place, she said, you should be happy to know that you've got roots to the depth where your sandstone layer is.
yeah.
And I kind of thought to myself, I think the roots came about during very wet years, and there hasn't been microbial activity in these dry years to break them down. So I'm kind of trying to understand this whole soil organism life. And if I've got 3 inches and 400 psi, I really don't have microbial activity below that in these dry years.
I think you're right. So microbes live in the water films around soil particles. And so if it's bone dry, they go dormant. They need the water to live. Um, so if it's bone dry, they're not going to be doing anything. They'll be limited by water just as the plants are.
Thank you very much. You've really been excellent. Sure appreciate it.
Yep, no, and I appreciate getting the opportunity. It's always nice to
Perfect.
talk directly to producers.
Hopefully, Grant, you got your answer. Okay. Are there any more questions? I guess I don't see any more questions. So, oh, there is another question. Measurement of carbon has been discussion one tool has come out, which is a tool pulled behind a quad and takes reading as it is pulled across the land. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I believe you're talking about the soil carbon acid solutions tool, which is based on the neutron inelastic scattering. And so I didn't touch on it. There's some other new sensor approaches. So some of those based on infrared light reflectance. Um, so this, so fundamentally, like the tool they're proposing does work to some extent. So the way it works is it's the neutrons are bouncing back to the sensor. It's getting emitted and bouncing back depending on the amount of carbon molecules that are there. So they will get more of a signal back if there's more carbon. So that makes sense. But the amount of soil that's actually getting measured, like the depth of soil, depends on things like water content and clay content and other things. And so whether you're getting a signal from 10 centimeters or 15 centimeters is going to vary. And it responds to inorganic carbon and organic. It can't tell the difference whether it's the limestone that's in the soil that's all over the place or whether it's from the plant organic matter. And so, and the studies that I read are the initial publications. It worked well after calibration, but with all of these things, the big elephant in the room is how much calibration is needed and what kind of calibration process is needed. Because I could go and get some sensor tools to work really well for you, but it's going to cost way more in calibration cost than it's going to be in just sending the samples to the lab. So I'd be cautious if someone's running around selling that to you right now. I don't think it's at the point where it would be reliable enough to sell a carbon credit off of.
Perfect. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay, I don't see any more questions. Before I conclude, I had a short announcement. Oh, I think so. Grant wants to talk. Yeah, Grant, you need to unmute yourself. Oh, there you go.
Okay. Uh, the cover crops comments that you made,
Yeah.
I guess, are ones that are always concerning to me because I know too, if it doesn't have water to grow, how
Yeah.
can it grow? And yet at the same time, I know so many of us are turning to that as a solution. And I guess your comment about Ontario and the moisture, and then you hear people like Gabe Brown saying, you could have 10 inches and cover crops still are very beneficial.
Mhm.
So anyway, that's the question.
Well, I mean, it all comes, as much as I'm a scientist, it comes down to economics too, right? Like, what's your cost versus benefit of these things? And so I've been doing some work with Dr. Laura Van Oord at the University of Guelph Ridgetown. And yeah, I think there's lots of applications in Ontario where cover crops are a great tool, particularly when you think core soy and winter wheat rotation and you get your winter wheat off in August. And you have till November in Ontario, right, for crop growth to still happen. And so, but yeah, you really have to think about what your growing season looks like in your rotation. Personally, I think it might be like if what matters is carbon, it might be some other things about thinking about, and I'm just kind of brainstorming here, but like, okay, what crops are you growing? Um, Obviously there's the if you can bale or swath graze or other things, but you kind of think about how much residue is getting left behind by different crops, because if you're modifying your rotation in ways that you're ensuring that you're maximizing residue, then that is another strategy that doesn't involve a whole other seeding event happening with all the costs associated with that.
Okay. Okay, Grant, you got your answer?
The
Okay,
kind of answer.
yeah. Okay. Okay, I guess there's no more questions. So I have a quick announcement to make before I conclude this webinar about some of my upcoming workshop. On 26th February, I have a crop production workshop. This might be Kelly Turngeston's last ever workshop. He's retiring after that. So, and it's a free workshop. And on March 5th, I have a farm succession to do register for both of them if anybody is interested. Okay, I will conclude this webinar. Thank you, Dr. Preston, for answering those questions and for an amazing presentation. It was truly a pleasure to have you with us. That brings an end to our webinar. Thank you all for attending. We hope you found this webinar informative and useful and enjoyed the discussion. If you have any feedback or suggestions about future topics, feel free to share with us and via email. And if you have any questions for Dr. Preston, you can always send me an email and I can forward it to him. And have a great day, guys. Thank you all.